Hey everyone, in this video I want to go through some tips and tricks that you can use to make successful sourdough bread all year round. This video is going to focus in particular on making sourdough bread in hot weather or hot climates. I live in Brisbane in Australia and we have a subtropical climate. So the summertime is traditionally our wet season and the weather is quite warm. We get lots of rainfall in summertime, and in winter that's our cooler and also our drier season. We have lots of sunny days here in wintertime. It's very beautiful and it doesn't get that cold. I'm filming this in late February, so it is late summer. It's about 10 a.m. in my kitchen here today, and I'm expecting it's probably going to reach about 30 degrees Celsius today, and the humidity is fairly high. We have had very, very high humidity days recently. Today's not too bad. At the moment now at 10 a.m. it's 28.9 degrees Celsius, which is 84 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not extremely hot, but it's pretty warm, and it's 77% humidity. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and make a standard loaf of bread. This is going to be a whole wheat, freshly milled whole wheat sourdough loaf of bread. And I'm just going to make it in a one-day process. So I'm going to ferment it and proof it and bake it all in one day. And I'm going to give you some ideas on what I do to manage the sourdough bread and what's really important to know. This advice goes for any sourdough bread making, but especially if you're using freshly milled flour, and especially if you're baking with 100% whole grains in your sourdough bread, which I do for 95% of the time pretty much. Over the many years that I've been helping people with their sourdough bread making, I think it's just probably a bit of bad luck really, but often it's the people who start their sourdough in summertime. If you start your sourdough bread making skills and making your starter in summertime, it is harder and people do run into problems. This is the recipe that I'm using. It's really, really basic. I'm using 500 grams of wheat, which I'm going to mill in my Mockmill. I'm probably going to use 425 grams of water, 85%, 9 grams of salt, some sourdough starter from the fridge, which I'll talk about, and I'm going to autolyse this for about an hour, but I'll talk that through as I go through the recipe. You're going to see throughout this video that actually it's all about temperature and managing and controlling temperature, and it's also about reading your dough. I'm always a really big advocate for people learning how to read their dough, because sourdough bread recipes are only good if you are making them under the same conditions that the person who designed the recipe was making them in terms of timing. The timing for everything in a recipe, you can pretty much ignore it because your starter is going to do its own timing dependent on the starter itself and the health of it, and just, you know, the actual specific yeasts and lactic acid bacteria that you have in it. Some will ferment faster than others, but it also really depends on your environment. I just actually completely ignore timing with sourdough bread recipes. I try and give guidelines in my recipes, but honestly, they can only ever be guidelines. And if there is one piece of advice that I give people for sourdough bread making, is don't hold on to the recipes, especially if you're using freshly milled flour. That's a whole other topic. There is so much variation in the wheats that we're using, the flours that we're using. Even if they're not freshly milled, they can vary a lot, country to country, region to region. So much variation. And then you add in all the variables of the water that you're using, the water temperature, the flour temperature, the air temperature, the starter temperature, how you might control the temperature throughout the fermentation. So it's really all about temperature. All right, let's get started. So the first stop is your flour. When you're making sourdough bread, it's good to try and keep things a little more on the cooler side than the warm side of things. When you're baking bread with commercial yeast, recipes will often tell you to use warm use warm water and keep everything nice and warm. Commercial baker's yeast is very different to sourdough, and sourdough bread can get very, very sour if you ferment it too warm. It can also over ferment and get out of control a bit too easily if it's too warm. So I like to keep things as cool as possible. In wintertime, sometimes I do warm things up a little bit, but in summertime, I do everything I can to prolong the process and keep it cool, because cool basically means that you've got more control. If you are freshly milling your flour, I've got my temperature gun here. I don't actually use this for my bread making, I should say. I'm not that precise with my bread making. You don't need to take the temperature of everything. I'm just doing that for this video. When you freshly mill your flour, depending on your mill, depending on how finely you mill the wheat, it will be warm when it comes out of the mill. Let me just see the temperature of that. It's 39 degrees Celsius, which is 103. So that flour is quite warm. So one way to counteract that is you can pre-mill your flour if you like and put it in the fridge to cool it down. But what I do is whenever I've got warm flour, especially in summer, in wintertime I don't bother, I just use tap water. But in summertime I use cold water in my flour, and that balances out the warmth of the freshly milled flour. So I've just got my jug of water from the fridge. I always keep this full for my bread making in summer. I use it to feed my starter and everything. And I'm going to do an autolyse with this recipe, which basically just means to soak the flour and the water together first before any salt or sourdough starter are added. And so I'm going to mix the cold water into the warm flour, stir that up and just let that sit for an hour, and then I'll come back and add the salt and the starter. This recipe is going to be roughly about 85% hydration. So I've got 500 grams of flour that I milled, and I'm going to add 425 grams of cold water from the fridge straight into there. I'm just pouring that cold water in. So there's my cold water. So I'll just mix my water into the flour to do the autolyse. If you've got a hard wheat flour, like a hard white or a hard red wheat flour, not always, but generally speaking, an autolyse, which is this pre-soaking of the flour and water, it really does help the texture of your whole grain, whole wheat, 100% whole wheat sourdough bread. So I've mixed that water into the flour. Let's take the temperature now. 25 degrees. So that dough there is 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 Fahrenheit. That's perfect. 25 degrees. Today is going to be a lot hotter than 25, but I have started off my bread with a cooler temperature. If I had have just used tap water or room temperature water with my 40 degrees C flour and say my 30 degrees C tap water, this dough would have been a lot warmer to start with, and it would have been, harder to control the fermentation if it goes too fast, and also the flavor. This dough will have a beautiful flavor, but without being too sour. I'll just scrape down the sides of that bowl, make sure all the flour's in there, and I will leave that for an hour and come back and add the starter and the salt. Okay, so it's been an hour. The dough has been soaking with water for the autolyse for 1 hour. And what we do now is I'm just going to add in the sourdough starter and the salt, and then the dough can do its main fermentation. I just want to show you though, this is a really key thing that I also do in summertime, is I always use cold sourdough starter straight from the fridge. The first reason for that is that it's really convenient. I just keep my starter here in the fridge. The last time I used that was a few days ago, so it's reasonably fresh. I do use my starter from the fridge mainly for the convenience of it. I don't have to pre-plan when I make my bread. We usually make a couple of loaves a week at least, sometimes more, sometimes less, but as long as you don't leave this for weeks and weeks and weeks, it will still be fresh enough. It will have enough life in it to raise your bread perfectly. All of my videos that I've ever made have all been made with sourdough starter that has been in the fridge for at least a few days. So also, this really helps for hot weather. So adding a cold sourdough starter into your starting to get warm dough, that really makes a difference. Plus, it's easy. You don't have to do anything. In wintertime though, you know, you might want to let your sourdough starter come to room temperature before you add it to your dough, and it's a completely different ball game in winter. It's basically everything I'm saying in reverse. You know, you will need to warm things up depending on how cold your situation is. So I'm just going to add about 9 grams of salt to this, which I'm not going to weigh it because I know from experience it's about 1.3 teaspoons. So I'm just putting my starter in. This is just a whole wheat starter. It's been there for a couple of days, as I said. Put that in. I just leave a little bit behind, and I won't show you all of this because the video will get too long. But when I feed my sourdough starter, and I will put a link to my video where I go into depth about my sourdough starter maintenance method, this easy method. There's another video for that, so I'll link to that. But the basic thing that I do is I feed my starter with fresh water, fresh flour. I let it ferment alongside my dough for a few hours, and then it goes back into the fridge for next time. Simple as that. But in summertime, I also feed my starter using cold water so that it doesn't over ferment either, because I leave it out while my dough is out fermenting. I leave my starter to ferment as well, and I don't want it getting over fermented because it won't last as long in the fridge. So feed your starter with cold water as well, and it will be a lot less likely to over ferment, and it will keep longer in the fridge as well if it's not over fermented. I'm just going to mix my dough now. Sometimes I mix it by hand, but I can't be bothered today. So I've mixed my dough, I've mixed my starter, I fed it with cold water. The starter temperature, the jar anyway, is 26 degrees Celsius. It's 29 degrees Celsius now. So today the weather is probably going to reach at least about 30 Celsius. At this point, on a hot day, this is when I think to myself, what have I got to do? What's my schedule? What's my availability? So I've been making sourdough bread week in, week out, every season, summer, winter, all through the year for 15 years now. And this is what I do. When I make my bread, I don't let work get in the way of it. I don't let anything get in the way of it. If I need bread, I figure out a way to do it. And it's usually by manipulating the temperatures. So on a hot day like today, it's 11:45, quarter to midday. I have to go out for a few hours. I think today, this dough, if I just left it out at room temperature, it would be ready to proceed on to shaping probably within about 3 hours. In hot weather, it can be even sooner in really hot weather. 3 to 4 hours and this will be ready to go, and it'll be quite warm by then, and it will be starting to get quite sour, which I don't like. So I'm actually going to cool this down. Because it's nearly midday when I'm starting, I'm not going to cool it down a lot. I want it to be ready in about 4 or 5 hours so that I can bake it this afternoon. However, if I was starting this in the evening and I wanted to ferment this bread overnight and bake it the next morning, which is a wonderful thing, you know, a really, really cool way to make your bread, and you can do that in summertime too. It's really easy to do that in winter because it's often cool enough. It will ferment overnight beautifully. But in summertime, if you want to ferment your bread overnight or for a whole day, so if you've got to go out for a work day, I would mix my dough before I went to work. I wouldn't bother with the autolyse, so I would just make a really basic dough and just mix it all together. And I would put it in a cooler with an ice brick for the day. And I would use cold water, use the cooler, and say if I went to work at about 8:30 a.m. and I get home about 5:30 or 6 p.m, it would be fermented enough for me to bake just in the early evening, or in the morning if I started the night before. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I will take my starter, I'll just put that under my arm, and I'll take my bread. I've got this little storage room. It's actually in my linen closet as well, but I've got some coolers in here. So what I will do is just pull out my big cooler, which just lives in here. I use it for some soap making things. So if I've got a hot summer night or hot summer day and I have to go to work, I will put my starter in here and my bread that I just mixed, and I will put that there, and I will grab a ice brick from my freezer. I've got a whole collection of them. If it's a really hot day, I'll use this big one. If it's not too hot, I'll use this medium-sized one. And I'll put the ice brick in there with the bread. Whoops. With the bread and the starter, and close the lid. Now that one ice brick in there will keep that bread and that starter from getting over fermented if I've got to go out all day or sleep overnight. So I don't need to put this in a cooler with an ice brick today. I'm not going to be out for that long. I don't need to slow it down that much. So I'm just going to do a modified version. This is something else you can do. There's all sorts of ways you could set this up, just use your creativity. Put my starter and my bread together, and I'm just going to put one ice brick beside and one on top. Nudge that one a little bit closer to the starter, and I'm just going to wrap it up in a tea towel, and that will just insulate it a bit, enough just to slow it down a little bit. I don't want it to go at a snail's pace today. I want to be able to bake this afternoon. But I just want to give myself a little bit more time when I head out to the shop so I don't have to rush back and worry about it over fermenting. So I will head out now, and I'm just going to leave this here on the bench. These ice bricks are going to melt quite quickly because it's hot, and I haven't insulated this much other than the towel. But that should be just enough to keep it a little bit cooler. We'll check the temperature of this dough when I get back, and we'll see. All right, be back a bit later. I'm back from my shopping. It is now 2:30 p.m. I'm going to take away these ice packs. They're pretty melted now. Still cold, but very much melted. And just have a little look at the dough. Now that I'm home, I can monitor this, so I don't need the ice packs anymore. They are really useful if you're going to be out for a long time and you don't want your dough to over ferment. But as soon as I get home, this dough is quite cool now because of the ice brick sitting next to it. So I'm going to take the ice brick away and just let it ferment. With the mixing that I did with this dough before, you don't really need to stretch and fold if you're mixing it the way I did, but stretching and folding helps to regulate the temperature in your dough too. If you've got cold spots and warm spots, giving it a fold every now and then not only improves the crumb, but it helps even out the temperature. Let's see what that temperature is. 22 degrees Celsius, 71 Fahrenheit. That is about perfect. If you could say what is the best temperature to ferment sourdough bread at, I would say 22 degrees is it. And this is roughly about the air temperature that I might have on a winter's day here in Brisbane. Might be a little bit warmer than that, some days maybe a little bit colder, but that's about ideal. So you can see that just using some cold assistance on a hot day like today has really helped this dough stay a nice manageable temperature. It's not going to over ferment on me. I can keep an eye on it now. It's going to start warming up now that I'm home and I've taken the ice bricks away, but I'll be here. I can keep an eye on it, and once it starts to get a little bit kind of puffy and showing some signs of getting some air in it, some CO2 gas, I will shape it and then I can bake it a little bit later. So I'll just leave that out. I'll leave my starter just at room temperature too. And the same with the starter. Once it starts to show some bubbles inside, I'll put it back in the fridge where it will stay for the next bake. I thought I'd come outside for a second because I just thought of another analogy for understanding this sourdough fermentation in summertime. It's summertime here in Brisbane. I've been working in my garden this morning and you can tell that this is a summer garden. Everything is green and growing like crazy. I have to prune everything all the time. It's just wild. There's so much growth. Marigolds. It looks a little bit sparse over there because I've just been weeding everything. But it's a bit like sourdough bread making in summertime is a bit like having a garden. If you've got moisture and you've got a lot of warmth, you're going to get a lot of rapid growth fast. This is my gorgeous avocado tree. Whereas in winter, everything slows down. Yeah, everything slows down and you don't get all that rapid growth, and you can really just sort of take it easy a little bit more in winter time. Anyway, I thought that might help you understand it a bit better. It's only about another 20 minutes later, but this dough is fermented enough for me. I'd rather under ferment it slightly for this main fermentation and then keep an eye on it as it proofs, because if it goes too far at this stage, it's hard to save it. But once you have got it proofing in your bread tin or your banneton or however you're proofing it, you can keep an eye on it, and just once it looks ready, you can bake it. So I'm just going to do a really easy method. I'm going to put it on some baking paper and then just sit that in my banneton. And then when it comes time to bake, I'm just going to lift it up with the paper and put it in my baker. It is really a warm afternoon. I'm just going to dampen my bench rather than using flour. I find it easier to use water. And this dough, look how sloppy it is. I probably shouldn't have used such high hydration. The higher hydration you have in your dough, that impacts fermentation as well. The more wet the dough is, the faster it will ferment. So that's something to bear in mind. And in hot weather, the real risk with sourdough, especially whole grain like this, whole grain flour ferments, whole grain dough I should say, of any type, ferments more rapidly as well, because all of the microbes from the bran, all the nutrients in the wheat help to feed the fermentation as well. So everything is really sped up a lot. I'm just going to do a really basic shaping. Gosh, look how sloppy that is. Okay, yeah, that wasn't good, was it? Oh dear, this is pretty wild. Oh, I'll do another one that way. Just kind of really gently handle it. It's a bit wonky. My shaping is often a bit wonky, which is why I use basic methods, because you can get away with not very good shaping if you use simple baking methods. Use wet hands because your hands won't stick to the dough then, and then just lift it onto the paper and then lift this on here. At this point you could put this in the fridge and leave it overnight in the fridge. If it's not too far gone, if the fermentation hasn't advanced too much, you can do that. However, if your dough is very, very well fermented, especially in summertime, especially when the dough temperature might be higher, then I would warn against fermenting in the fridge, unless you can only really get away with that in summertime if your fermentation hasn't gone too far. Because if the dough is warm, it will take quite a while for the coolness of the fridge to get inside the dough, and the dough will continue fermenting. So I have had fridge fermented bread that I've overproofed in the fridge essentially. So in summertime you can definitely do it, but you've just got to be careful and make sure you err on the side of caution and get your dough in the fridge earlier rather than later. But I'm just going to bake this all in one day. I'm going to leave this in summertime. The final proof generally for me takes about half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe up to an hour. You really don't want to wait too long. In wintertime, that could take up to 2 hours. It's a completely different ball game in wintertime, and it's all to do with this temperature. So I'm just going to leave this 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and I'll put my oven on and we'll get this baked. It'll be quite fast. Whole grain sourdough especially, but any sourdough bread turns to soup. If it over ferments, the lactic acid bacterial fermentation will just go so quickly and it will completely break down the gluten in the dough, especially if you've got high hydration, especially if you're using all whole grains. So these are the reasons why you want to really control the temperature and keep an eye on it, and bake it, probably for beginners, bake it a little bit sooner than you think it might need to be baked. It's a real classic rookie mistake. People let their dough double and let it get really puffy before they put it in the oven, and then it flops. Sourdough bread, you're looking for a really subtle proof. You definitely don't want it to be doubled. You just want it to start to look a little bit puffy, and then get it in the oven. That's all you need. So it has been a grand total of 30 minutes since I shaped this dough. I shaped it, and then 20 minutes later I put my oven on, and it's been 10 minutes since then, and my oven is preheated. And look at the size of this dough. I don't know if you can tell, but it is definitely increased in volume. I can see some really thin, light little air bubbles there. It is ready to bake. This is a very wet dough, I will admit that. That is a habit of mine. I'm not sure if it's a good one or not, but if I let this go any longer, it would pretty much turn to a sticky, horrible soup. I'm going to do another video a bit like this soon, where I go through step by step the process of making sourdough bread, and I'm going to show how you can judge the timing for everything, and that will be a little bit different to this video. But you can see the little jiggle. That's a good test. If your dough jiggles like that, it's got a little bit of buoyancy and a bit of movement in it, that's a good sign that you've got some CO2 built up inside. So I'm just going to bake this now, and I'll show you the results. Well, I'm slightly embarrassed about this. My bread is quite flat, but oh well, never mind. So the reason why this bread spread so much is that I overhydrated it. Way too much water for this wheat. And I'm also, to be really honest with you, I'm really out of practice in baking freeform loaves. Most of the time I bake my loaves in tins, and this, you know, you can get away with much higher hydration in tins. But, you know, it is what it is. The tips that I've already shared in this video have got nothing to do with this problem. I don't think the bread was overly over-fermented. It doesn't smell really sour, which is great. I've prevented that by keeping things cool. This is just too much water for that recipe, which is a totally separate issue. But never mind, I will have a look at the crumb. I'll cut it open in the morning. I think it'll still be pretty nice bread. Certainly smells good.